The high timber country of the Idaho Territory in 1889 was no place for weak men, and it was certainly no place for dying children. Caleb Vance was a man stripped down to his bare essentials. His homestead had been burned to ash in an Oregon Range war. His wife was buried beneath a shallow mound of prairie dirt, and resting against his aching back was his 6-year-old son, Toby, whose shallow, rattling breaths sounded like dry leaves scraping across a wooden coffin lid. Caleb had walked 80 miles through jagged mountain passes. His boots were split at the soles, the raw leather biting into the blistered flesh beneath. He wasn't looking for gold, and he wasn't looking for trouble. He was looking for a miracle. When he staggered into the dust-choked yard of the Blackwood lumber mill, the heavy whir of a steam-powered saw echoed through the pines, accompanied by the cold, clear rush of a mountain stream. Water, shelter, life. Caleb collapsed to his knees at the foot of the main porch, his muscles trembling under the boy's weight. He looked up, his bloodshot eyes squinting through the heat glare. Standing on the porch was a woman. She stood dead still, a double-barreled shotgun held low across her waist. She wore a dark gray work dress, her hair pulled back in a tight, practical knot. Her gray eyes tracked Caleb's staggering approach with the sharp, unyielding scrutiny of a hawk. This was Maeve Sterling, and in the Idaho Territory, a lone widow running a timber mill didn't stay alive by offering charity to strangers. "That's far enough, mister," Maeve said. Her voice was flat, carrying the cold edge of river slate. Caleb reached up with a trembling hand, tipping his sweat-stained hat. "Ma'am," he rasped, his throat raw, "I don't mean no harm. My boy, he's burning up with the dry rot cough. He won't make another night." Maeve didn't lower the gun. She stepped to the edge of the porch, her gaze shifting from Caleb's hollow face to the limp child strapped to his coat. Toby groaned, a small, pained sound that cut through the mountain air. "I ain't a hospital," Maeve said, though her knuckles loosened slightly on the wooden stock. "I can work," Caleb pleaded, his voice cracking. "I can fell the largest pines on the ridge. I can mend your flumes, shoe your draft horses, break your timber teams. Anything you need. I don't want coin, ma'am. Just a cup of milk, a warm bed, and a drop of apothecary medicine for the boy." Silence stretched between them, thick as the pine resin hanging in the afternoon heat. Maeve slowly lowered the barrels of the shotgun. She walked down the porch steps, the hem of her heavy dress trailing in the dirt. She reached out, pressing the back of her hand against Toby's flushed cheek. "He's fading," she whispered. Her voice softened, exposing a deep, jagged grief beneath her hard shell. 3 winters ago, the land had taken her husband and her infant child, leaving her alone in a house built for a family. She looked Caleb square in the eye, her jaw set like iron. "I don't need a hired hand, Caleb Vance," Maeve said, her words dropping like lead weights. "I can hire day laborers from town, but I have a condition, a price for the medicine, the milk, and the roof over his head." Caleb held his breath. "Name it." "You sign over legal guardianship of the boy to me," Maeve said flatly. "You stay here. You work this land until your hands bleed into the timber. But on paper, and in this house, he becomes my son. I want a child to fill these empty rooms, and a legacy to keep." The world seemed to stop. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. "You want me to sell you my flesh and blood?" he growled, his protective instincts flaring. "I'm not asking you to abandon him." Maeve snapped back, her eyes flashing. "I'm asking for a family. You want him to live? That is the cost." Caleb looked down at his son. Toby's skin was a terrifying shade of crimson, his breathing growing fainter by the second. He had no money, no horse, no time left. "All right," Caleb choked out, his throat closing up. "Save him. He's yours." Maeve didn't hesitate. She stepped forward and carefully unbuckled the straps, taking the small, feverish boy into her arms. Caleb stood alone in the quiet yard, his arms feeling impossibly light and hollow. He watched Maeve carry his son inside the warm house before he turned slowly toward the dark, quiet tack room of the barn. As the heavy wooden door creaked shut behind him, Caleb sat down in the shadows, staring at his blistered hands, wondering if he had just saved his son's life, or made a terrible deal with the devil. Inside the main cabin, The night passed to the rhythm of a mother's desperate medicine. Maeve Sterling worked with quiet, practiced precision. She crushed dried willow bark in a stone mortar, steeping the bitter powder into boiling water over the cast-iron stove. Every hour on the hour, she sat beside Toby's bed, lifting the boy's weak head to pour a few drops down his throat. She bathed his burning forehead with rags dipped in ice-cold mountain spring water, whispering soft, forgotten lullabies into the dark. Out in the cold tack room of the barn, Caleb didn't sleep. He sat on a pile of coarse burlap sacks, listening to the wind howl through the pine ridge. Every creak of the floorboards from the house felt like a phantom hand pulling his son further away from him. Then, as the first gray light of dawn bled through the cracked shutters, the cabin door creaked open. Caleb was on his feet in an instant, crossing the damp grass in 3 long strides. Maeve stood on the porch, her face pale with exhaustion, dark circles hollowed beneath her eyes. But her expression was calm. "The fire in his skin is gone," she whispered, her voice gravelly from the night's vigil. "He broke the fever an hour before sunrise. He's sleeping now." Caleb closed his eyes. A single breath shuddered out of his chest, carrying the weight of 80 brutal miles. "Thank God," he rasped. "God had nothing to do with it." Maeve replied sharply, turning back toward the kitchen. "The willow bark did the work. Now go earn your keep, Caleb Vance. The north flume is jammed, and the timber chutes won't fix themselves." Caleb channeled his overwhelming relief into sheer physical destruction. He worked with a terrifying mechanical focus. For 12 straight hours under a blistering sun, he swung a heavy broadaxe, clearing tangled logs from the mill's water chutes. He hauled iron-bound beams that would have broken 2 lesser men. His boots sank into the freezing mountain mud as he re-anchored the rotting timber flumes, the cold spray soaking his canvas trousers. In the afternoon, he tackled the barn, taming a pair of wild, skittish draft horses that had kicked out 3 previous ranch hands. He spoke to the massive beasts in low, steady murmurs, his scarred hands firm on their leather halters until their ears flattened in submission. He pushed his body to the absolute brink, welcome for the pain. Physical agony was easier to bear than the quiet panic gnawing at his gut. As the days turned into weeks, a strange, rhythmic routine took root at the Blackwood mill. While Caleb worked the yard until his palms bled into the soil, Maeve reclaimed the interior of the house. One afternoon, coming up from the saw pit to fetch a fresh grease rag, Caleb paused by the open kitchen window. Inside, bathed in a pool of golden sunlight, sat Toby. The flush of fever had been replaced by the healthy, vibrant pink of a recovering child. He was sitting at the heavy oak table, his small hand wrapped around a charred stick of charcoal. Maeve sat beside him, guiding his tiny fingers across the wide, yellowed pages of an old leather-bound mill ledger. "That's Toby," Maeve said, her voice softer than Caleb had ever heard it. "A is for ash, like the trees we harvest to build a home." Toby beamed, letting out a bright, ringing laugh that echoed through the quiet valley. The sound struck Caleb like a physical blow. He froze in the shadows of the porch, his heart twisting into a painful knot. It was a laugh he hadn't heard since before the Range War, back when his wife, Martha, was still alive and singing by their own hearth. Watching Maeve wipe a smudge of charcoal from his son's nose, Caleb felt a bitter, ugly surge of paternal jealousy. He felt like a ghost, an intruder standing outside the windows of his own life. On paper, his boy belonged to another woman. Yet, as he watched Maeve gently wrap a warm woolen blanket around Toby's shoulders to block the draft, the jealousy yielded to something deeper, a profound, solemn respect. She wasn't playing a game. She was protecting the boy with the fierce, unyielding devotion of a mother lion. That evening, the air turned crisp with the coming autumn frost. Inside the warm cabin, Toby was fast asleep beneath a thick quilt. Caleb sat near the hearth, grease-stained and exhausted, cleaning the gears of a handsaw. Across the room, Maeve sat by the light of a single tallow candle. In her lap was Caleb's spare work shirt, the canvas sleeve torn wide open from a stray nail in the timber flume. With nimble, deliberate movements, she pulled a threaded needle through the heavy fabric, stitching the raw edge closed. Caleb stopped his work. He looked at her hands, then up at her face, caught in the soft golden glow of the flame. Maeve paused. She lowered the shirt slightly, her gray eyes meeting his through the dim light. For the first time since he had staggered into her yard, the hard, iron mask slipped away, revealing two broken souls recognizing the same quiet grief in each other. It was a fleeting, unspoken moment of raw vulnerability. Then the silence was shattered. From down the valley, cutting through the quiet rustle of the pines, came a low, rhythmic thunder. It was the heavy, coordinated strike of multiple unshod horses galloping hard toward the mill gates. Caleb's hand instinctively dropped to the iron handle of his sidearm. Maeve's eyes went cold as River Slate once more as she reached for the double-barreled shotgun leaning against her chair. If you were in Caleb's shoes, facing a dying child on a desolate frontier, would you sign away legal guardianship to save his life? Or was Maeve taking advantage of a desperate father? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. The thunder of hooves ground to a sudden, violent halt just outside the main cabin door. Through the cracks in the wooden shutters, lantern light flickered against the dark timber, cutting through the autumn chill. Caleb didn't hesitate. He rose from his seat near the hearth, his fingers tightening around the cold, smooth handle of his broadaxe. Beside him, Maeve racked the lever of her shotgun with a sharp, metallic clatter that echoed through the quiet room. She looked toward the back bedroom, where Toby lay fast asleep, then met Caleb's eyes. A silent agreement passed between them. Maeve stepped out onto the porch first, the hem of her heavy dress brushing the floorboards. Caleb followed half a pace behind, slipping into the dark shadows of the overhang, the heavy iron axe resting across his shoulder like a dead weight. In the yard stood three riders, their silhouettes dark against the starlit Idaho sky. The man at the center sat tall in a silver-trimmed saddle, wearing a tailored wool coat that looked entirely out of place in the rugged mountain wilderness. This was Vance, the Iron Holcomb. Holcomb was a regional land grabber and cattle syndicate baron, a man who had bought up half the territory with blood money and corrupt contracts. Flanking him were two hired enforcers, their leather dusters pulled back just enough to expose the polished ivory grips of Colt revolvers sitting low on their hips. Holcomb tipped his brim with two fingers, a cold, practiced smile spreading across his face. "Evening, Mrs. Sterling," Holcomb said, his voice smooth and thick as molasses. "Cold night to be standing on a porch alone." "I'm not alone, Holcomb," Maeve replied, her voice cutting through the dark like a blade. "And you're trespassing on Blackwood land. State your business and turn those horses around." Holcomb let out a dry, quiet laugh. He leaned forward over his saddle horn, resting his leather-gloved hands on the pommel. "Always so direct," Holcomb murmured. "I'll make it simple for you, Maeve. The winter of '89 is coming, and it's going to be a hard one. A lone woman can't manage a mill this size when the timber flumes freeze over. I'm offering you a way out. $300 in gold for the entire parcel, the land, the saws, and the water rights." Maeve's hand tightened on her shotgun. $300 wouldn't pay for the timber I felled last month. "You're trying to rob me." "I'm offering you survival," Holcomb countered, his smile vanishing, replaced by a dark, predatory edge. "Because if you refuse, the syndicate will dam the upper creek. Without that water, your timber flumes go dry. Your saws stop turning, and your precious mill becomes nothing more than firewood." Before Maeve could answer, Caleb stepped out from the deep shadow of the porch pillar. He didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice. He simply took two deliberate steps forward into the moonlight, planting his heavy boots firmly on the top step. The broadaxe rested easily in his right hand, his posture balanced, grounded, and utterly lethal. His eyes locked onto the enforcer, sitting on Holcomb's left. The enforcer's hand froze an inch above his sidearm. The man leaned in, squinting through the dim light at Caleb's scarred face and the relaxed, balanced stance of his body. "Boss," the enforcer muttered under his breath, his confidence suddenly evaporating. "Look at his hands. Look at his balance." Holcomb glanced sideways. "What of him? He's just a driftwood farm hand." "No, he ain't," the deputy rasped, a bead of cold sweat breaking on his temple despite the chill. "I saw a man stand like that 6 years ago in the Oregon Range Wars. That ain't a timber cutter, Holcomb. That's Caleb Vance. He cleared out 3 syndicate gunmen in the Rogue River Valley before he vanished. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the yard. Holcomb's eyes narrowed as he reevaluated the man, standing on the porch. He saw the cold, unblinking focus in Caleb's gaze, the look of a man who had already lost everything and had nothing left to fear. Holcomb slowly pulled his reins back, settling his restless horse. "Is that so?" Holcomb said softly, his eyes tracking from Caleb back to Maeve. "You're keeping dangerous company, Mrs. Sterling." "He's my partner," Maeve said, her voice unwavering. "And he works here. Now get off my land." Holcomb held Caleb's gaze for 3 agonizing seconds before pulling his horse's head around toward the trail. "We'll leave for tonight," Holcomb said over his shoulder, his voice carrying a chilling, promised malice. "But remember this, Maeve. Unaffiliated lone women don't keep land for long in Idaho. Winter catches up to everyone." The 3 riders kicked their horses into a trot, disappearing into the black wall of the pine forest, the sound of their hooves fading into the night. As the dust settled in the quiet yard, Caleb slowly lowered the axe, his chest heaving with adrenaline. Maeve uncocked her shotgun, her shoulders trembling slightly as the tension broke. She turned to look at Caleb, her gray eyes wide in the moonlight. "You never told me you fought in the Oregon Range Wars," she whispered. "It's in the past," Caleb said flatly. "Why does he really want this place, Maeve? It ain't just about timber." Maeve walked to the edge of the porch, looking out over the dark valley where the mountain stream roared into the flumes. "It's the water," Maeve revealed, her voice heavy with grim realization. "The timber flumes control the main water route through the entire valley. If he gets this land, he controls the cattle, the lumber, and every small homestead from here to Oakhaven." She turned back to Caleb, her jaw set like iron. "He won't stop until I'm dead or broke, and now he knows who you are." The autumn wind blew harsh and cold through the mud-choked main street of Oakhaven. What had begun as a sleepy timber camp was now a roaring, lawless boomtown, swollen with railway speculators, syndicate thugs, and self-righteous homesteaders. The wooden wheels of the Blackwood Mill supply wagon groaned under the weight of winter preparations. Caleb sat on the bench, the leather reins held firm in his calloused hands, his eyes constantly scanning the boardwalks. Beside him sat Maeve, her posture straight as a pine, her dark wool cloak pulled tight against the chill. In the back of the wagon, sitting atop a pile of soft burlap sacks, 6-year-old Toby sang quietly to a wooden carved bird Caleb had whittled for him during the long night shifts. They needed 50 pounds of salt pork, 3 sacks of hard wheat flour, and a fresh bottle of willow bark tincture before the high mountain passes froze over. But as the wagon pulled up to Miller's General Store, the air grew thick with a different kind of frost. It was the cold, stinging judgment of civilized folk. Women in fine silk dresses leaned together on the boardwalk, whispering behind lace fans, their eyes darting toward the wagon like rusted needles. "Look at them," a woman murmured loudly enough for the wind to carry. "A lone widow living out in the timber with a nameless gunman, and that poor motherless child. It just ain't Christian." Caleb's jaw tightened. He kept his eyes fixed on the hitching post, but his pulse hammered in his ears. In the Wild West, a man could defend himself against a bullet, but a woman's reputation was a delicate currency. Once ruined by malicious tongues, it was impossible to buy back. "Ignore them, Caleb," Maeve said softly, her voice steady as marble. "Ponies bark at what they don't understand." They stepped inside the general store, the brass bell ringing above the door like an alarm. The storekeeper, a fat man with grease-stained spectacles, barely nodded as Maeve approached the counter with her list. While Caleb began hauling heavy bolts of wool canvas to the wagon, Maeve browsed the apothecary shelves at the back of the shop. Suddenly, the rustle of heavy petticoats announced the arrival of Martha Higgins, the mayor's wife and the undisputed queen of Oakhaven's gossip mill. Martha stepped directly into Maeve's path, her lips pulled into a thin, artificial smile that dripped with malice. "Clara, or should I say, Mrs. Sterling," Martha purred, her eyes scanning Maeve from head to toe. "We were all so terribly concerned when we heard about your new arrangement out at the mill." "My mill is running fine, Martha," Maeve replied coldly, not bothering to look up from a bottle of liniment. "Mind your own household." Martha's smile vanished, replaced by a sharp, condescending scowl. "We are thinking of the child, dear. A young boy raised on an isolated homestead with a drifter of questionable blood. Rumors are spreading that he isn't even yours. Some say he was stolen." Maeve stopped. She slowly placed the bottle back on the shelf and turned to face the mayor's wife. Her gray eyes locked onto Martha's with the terrifying intensity of a winter storm. "That boy is fed, Martha," Maeve said, her voice ringing clear across the silent store. "He is warm, he is loved, and he is taught his letters every single night. Can you say the same for the 3 street orphans, sleeping behind your husband's saloon right now? The ones begging for scrap bread in the alley while you buy silk dresses?" Martha gasped, her face flushing a dark, mottled purple. Her mouth worked frantically, but no words came out. Unable to withstand Maeve's piercing glare, she turned on her heel and scurried out the door like a frightened beetle. Outside, across the muddy street, 2 of Holcomb's enforcers stood under the wooden awning of the Golden Spur Saloon. They watched Caleb heave a 100-pound sack of grain into the back of the wagon with effortless, practiced strength. "That's him," one of the thugs muttered, spitting a stream of brown tobacco juice into the dirt. "Vance, the boss wants him put in the ground or behind bars before nightfall." The second thug grinned, gesturing toward the sheriff's office down the street. "Why waste lead when the law's already in our pocket? Go fetch Sheriff Miller. Tell him we got a wanted murderer sitting right out in the open." At the wagon, Caleb tied down the last flour sack with a tight hemp knot. He wiped the sweat from his brow, turning to check on Toby, who was giggling in the wagon bed. "All loaded up, son," Caleb said, offering the boy a faint smile. "We'll be back on the ridge before dusk." Then the heavy thud of iron-shod boots echoed off the boardwalk. Caleb froze. Stepping out from the deep shadows of the saloon came Sheriff Miller, a heavy-set man with a rusted tin star pinned to his leather vest, flanked by 4 deputies. All 5 men had their hands resting on the unholstered grips of their revolvers. Frontier towns often judged lone women far harsher than the lawless men around them. Do you think Maeve was right to face the town's hostility head-on? Or should she have kept a lower profile to protect Toby? Drop a comment down below. The click of cocking revolvers sounded like dry ice snapping in the afternoon heat. Caleb didn't reach for his gun. He slowly raised his scarred, calloused hands, keeping them flat and open in front of his chest. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his face remained a mask of stone. Sheriff Miller stepped forward, his fat belly hanging over a silver belt buckle. He held a crumpled, yellowed slip of telegraph paper in his left hand, his right hand resting firmly on the oak grip of his Colt .45. "Caleb Vance," Miller growled, his voice carrying across the silent street. "You're under arrest." Maeve rushed out of the general store, her eyes wide as she took in the sight of 5 armed men encircling the wagon. She immediately stepped into the street, placing her body directly between the deputies' drawn weapons and the wagon bed where Toby sat. "On what charge, Sheriff?" Maeve demanded, her voice like a whip. "He's done nothing wrong on this land." Sheriff Miller sneered, waving the telegraph paper in the air. "We got a wire straight from the territorial authorities in Wyoming. A man fitting his exact description, big build, scarred face, former range hand, is wanted for grand theft, train robbery, and the murder of a Union Pacific paymaster near Cheyenne." Caleb's eyes widened in sheer disbelief. "Wyoming," he roared, his voice cutting through the mud-choked street. "That's a lie and a farce. I ain't been to Wyoming in my life. I walked every single mile from the Rogue River Valley in Oregon. Look at my feet. Look at these split boots." Caleb pointed down at the worn, cracked leather clinging to his blistered heels. "I walked through 80 miles of mountain passes carrying my sick boy. You ask anyone on the Western Trail. I was in the Idaho high timber when that train was hit." "The wire says what it says, Drifter," Miller snapped, not bothering to glance at Caleb's feet. "And around here, the telegraph is the law until the circuit judge arrives." From the back of the wagon, Toby began to sob violently. The 6-year-old scrambled over the sacks of grain, throwing his tiny arms wildly around Caleb's neck. "Daddy, don't let them take you. Daddy, get the boy off him," one of the deputies barked, stepping forward with his gun raised. Touch that child, and I'll see you hanged in front of the territorial governor. Maeve spat, stepping right into the deputy's path, her chin lifted in fierce defiance. This ward is forged, Miller. Holcomb bought you, and everyone in this town knows it. The deputy shoved Maeve hard by the shoulder, sending her staggering backward into the dirt. Caleb's blood turned to liquid fire. His protective instincts flared like a prairie wildfire. His right hand twitched toward his holster, his muscles coiling to rip the deputy's gun from his hand and tear the street apart. Then he looked down. Toby was clinging to his waist, buried in his canvas coat, screaming in terror. Maeve was scrambling to her feet, completely unarmed, standing right in the crossfire. 5 revolvers were cocked and aimed at his chest. One stray bullet, one single nervous twitch of a trigger, and his son or Maeve would pay with their lives. The rage in Caleb's chest collapsed into a cold, suffocating despair. "Don't shoot," Caleb rasped, his voice breaking. He gently unclasped Toby's tiny hands from his coat, pressing the boy back into Maeve's arms. "Maeve, take the boy. Hold him." "Caleb, no." Maeve cried, her eyes brimming with sudden, furious tears. "Don't give up to them." "I won't let them hurt you," Caleb whispered, looking into her eyes with a quiet, devastating finality. "Take care of my son." Before Caleb could even raise his hands to surrender fully, 2 deputies rushed him from the side. A heavy iron pistol barrel slammed across the side of Caleb's jaw with a sickening crack. Caleb's knees buckled as the world spun into a blur of blood and dirt. The deputies swarmed over him like wolves, driving heavy boots into his ribs, pinning his arms behind his back. Cold iron manacles slammed shut around his wrists, biting deep into the raw flesh. "Daddy!" Toby screamed as Maeve held him tight against her chest, her own body trembling with a white-hot rage as she watched them drag Caleb down the mud-choked street. They hauled him down the steps of the town jail, shoving his bruised, bleeding body into a dark, freezing stone cell. The heavy iron door slammed shut with a deafening boom that felt like a nail driven into a coffin. Hours crawled by in the damp darkness. Outside, night fell over Oakhaven, bringing a bitter mountain frost. Maeve stood on the boardwalk outside the jail, refusing to leave, her hands wrapped tightly around Toby's cold fingers. Then, a tall shadow detached itself from the porch of the hotel. Vance the Iron, Holcomb walked slowly down the boardwalk, his silver-trimmed coat gleaming in the moonlight. He stopped inches from Maeve, leaning down slightly, a victorious, chilling smile playing on his lips. "He looks heavy in those chains, doesn't he, Maeve?" Holcomb whispered, his voice smooth as poison. "A shame. The sheriff says the hanging tree is already prepped out behind the livery. Circuit judge won't even need to ride in." Maeve turned her head slowly, her gray eyes burning like white-hot coals. "You forged that wire." Holcomb didn't deny it. He simply stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Sign the mill deed over to me by sunrise," Holcomb murmured, "or your hired murderer hangs at dawn, and you'll be left all alone in the freezing dark." Caleb sat in the cold, damp gloom of the cell, but the quiet didn't last long. News spread through town that Circuit Judge Thaddeus Vance, a high-ranking federal magistrate traveling with a squad of territorial marshals, had just arrived in Medicine Bow. Maeve didn't hesitate, armed not with a gun, but with the forged land deeds, Holcomb's extortion notes, and the mill's ledger. She marched straight to the judge's carriage. Impressed by her composure and clear evidence, Judge Vance immediately ordered a formal inquiry on the spot. Within hours, the magistrate marched into the jailhouse, flanked by marshals. Catching Sheriff Miller and Holcomb off guard, the judge exposed their conspiracy in front of the entire town. Sheriff Miller and Holcomb were immediately stripped of their authority, placed in irons, and loaded into a transport coach bound for the territorial capital for trial. The heavy cell door swung open, and Caleb stepped out a free man. With the shadow of corruption gone, peace settled over the Blackwood Mill. Caleb returned to his work, but the silence between him and Maeve had changed. The guarded distance was completely gone. As the weeks passed into a bright frontier spring, subtle moments began to bind them together. A shared glance across the kitchen table, A tender hand placed over his as they taught Toby his lessons, and quiet evenings watching the sunset over the valley. Standing on the porch under a golden sky, Caleb finally voiced what both had felt for months. He didn't just owe her his son's life and his freedom. He loved her. Maeve smiled, stepping into his embrace. They had built a home out of hardship, finding love on the wild edge of the frontier. What do you think was the defining moment that turned their business bargain into true love? Was it Maeve nursing Toby back to health through the feverish night, or her brave march to Judge Vance to expose the corruption and win Caleb's freedom? Thank you so much for watching Sarah's Wild West Chronicles. If you enjoyed this journey through the Old West, please don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop your thoughts in the comments down below. Until next time, keep the fire burning and stay true to the trail.